Last Sam's Cage by David A. Poulsen. Chapter 4, page 34. 1 week to the day after he arrived at the zoo, Eddie decided it was time to get out for a night. Even a person who doesn't mind being alone needs to talk to something that talks back once in a while. Jack Sim hadn't been around since that first night, and Eddie wanted to be with creatures that had the same number of legs as he did. It also was time to test his sneaking in and out technique. There was no point staying at the zoo in a permanent sort of way if he couldn't come and go whenever he wanted. The getting out part went fine. A couple of days before, he'd found a perfect break in the chain link fence. It was just big enough for someone his size. No one saw him leave, which was good because he didn't like the idea of some weirdo finding his secret entrance. One of the best things about the zoo was that once it was closed to the public, the only people Eddie ever saw were the staff, and as far as he knew, they hadn't seen him. He decided to celebrate it. It was sort of an anniversary, 1 week of freedom, with a cheeseburger and a chocolate shake. He'd been eating a lot of soup, mostly because it was the cheapest thing at the concession, but now he was really looking forward to something that didn't have vegetables floating in it. He went to a hamburger place just outside the zoo gates. It looked as if it had been there a long time, and wasn't improving with age. But Eddie felt like he was eating at the fanciest place in town. He made himself chew slowly, the way they tell people to in those ads for losing weight. It was the best meal he'd had in a long time. When he finished the burger and fries, he picked up the rest of the shake and wandered in the direction of Chinatown. He had a couple of friends there. In fact, Charlie Chen was probably Eddie's best friend, and he figured he owed it to Charlie to let him know what was going on. Eddie hadn't told anyone about his plans to run away before he actually did, partly because he was afraid that his mom and Steve would find out, and partly because he didn't want to look like a jerk if he chickened out at the last minute. But now that he was a real live runaway, it was time to let Charlie in on it. Eddie knew he'd have to be careful. He was positive Steve and his mom would have reported him to the cops by now. If he got caught, he'd be back home before the night was out. One of the rules of his probation was that he had to live at home. Eddie laughed every time he thought about that. Better to be at home where you might get killed than to run away. Yeah, that made sense. Anyway, the cops could be watching Charlie's place, and Eddie wasn't about to let himself be caught. Charlie wasn't his real name. It was Kenny, but he was called Charlie after an old Chinese movie detective. There was a Charlie Chan movie on TV one night, and some of the kids had seen it. By the time school got out the next day, Kenny Chen was Charlie, and had been ever since. The nickname had surprised Eddie. Well, actually, the surprising part was that Kenny Chen was okay with it. If he hadn't been, Eddie was pretty sure nobody would have dared use the name. Charlie was somebody you don't mess with. Charlie lived in an apartment over a dumpy groceries and restaurant on Center Street that looked like it could fall down if a decent breeze came along. Eddie remembered telling Charlie that somebody should knock the place down before it caved in or caught fire or something. They'll never do that, Charlie shook his head. The place's history. Dr. Sun Yat-sen came to Calgary back in 1910 or so, and spoke to all the Chinese people in the city right in this building. Who? Dr. Sun Yat-sen. He was a Chinese revolutionary, a hero to our people. Charlie got kind of excited when he talked about the guy. Eddie thought it was strange that Charlie had even heard of Dr. Sun Yat-sen, and it was stranger still that Charlie cared about some guy, hero or not, who gave a speech a million years ago in the building where he lived. All Eddie ever seen Charlie get excited about was action movies, the kind where 30 or 40 people get killed off in the first 10 minutes. So this was different. Alright. But Eddie always figured it would be better not to say too much about it. Charlie wasn't much fun to be around when he was mad. There were stories around school that Charlie was tight with one of the Asian gangs that hung out a few blocks north of Chinatown. Eddie didn't know one way or the other. Even though they were pretty good friends, it wasn't something they talked about. The only thing he did know was that everybody, even the tough guys at school, cut Charlie a lot of slack. Eddie stuck mostly to side streets and back alleys on the way to Charlie's place. He stood in the shadows across the street from Charlie's building, for a long time. When he was sure that no cops were around, he crossed the street and went around to the back. The stairs looked like they'd been stuck to the outside of the building with crazy glue. When he got up to the top, there was no screen door, only a wooden one, with most of the finish gone. He knocked. Charlie's sister, Linda, came to the door. Linda was a total hottie in grade 9. Eddie had thought a few times about asking her out, but gave up on the idea mostly because he was sure she'd say no. Eddie knew that some girls liked being asked out by older guys, but not guys who looked like him. So he'd never ask. So since going out of your way to get blown off. "Kenny's not here," Linda told him, and then invited him in. "You want a Coke or anything? A coffee?" "No thanks, I was just wandering around and figured I'd stop in and see Kenny. You know where he is?" Eddie didn't think he should sit down. He didn't want Linda to get the idea he'd be hard to get rid of. "Probably at the castle." Linda smiled more or less in Eddie's direction. He liked the way the corners of her eyes wrinkled up. In fact, there wasn't a whole lot about Linda Chen he didn't like. He'd just started to think that sitting down might not be such a bad idea after all when the phone rang. Linda left the room to answer it, which gave Eddie a chance to look around. He'd never been in the place before. Charlie always met him somewhere or made him wait in the alley at the bottom of the stairs. He noticed the smell of Chinese food, no big surprise, since the restaurant was right below. It was an okay smell, but he wasn't sure he'd like to live with it all the time. Except for the smell, there wasn't a whole lot about the place that seemed Chinese. The furniture wasn't that different from what he'd seen in most of his friends' houses, except that this stuff was all older looking. There was a brown couch that was worn through in a couple of places. The room had a lot of stuff in it, but only one table, a short, wide one that stood in the corner next to the TV. There were things on the table that really did look Chinese instead of the usual books and ceramic horses and pictures. This table had four carvings, maybe porcelain. There were 3 old Chinese men in flowing robes, and in the center of the table was a small building. He wasn't sure what kind of building it was, maybe a temple or something. It had lots of layers, like a fountain or one of those cakes they display in bakery windows. Eddie liked the little building. He thought he might ask Linda about it when she came back. He noticed something else, too. Even though some of the furniture looked as if it was ready to collapse from age and wear, the room was clean. Real clean, in fact. It looked like Linda had been cleaning just before he got there. A broom, a dustpan were leaning against the wall, and there was a lemonish smell in the room. The lemon smell mixed in with the smell of the Chinese food. It wasn't a nice mix. He was still looking at the stuff on the table when Linda came back. "You can sit down, you know," she smiled. He looked down at his feet. He did that sometimes. He wasn't sure why. Maybe to warn them, "Don't go clumsy on me right now." He walked over to the couch and sat down carefully to avoid a spring that was poking through. Thanks. So how's everything going?" He wished he could have come up with something a little more exciting to say, but every time he looked at Linda, it was like his communication skills disappeared. "Okay," she answered. "What about you? I haven't seen you around school for a while." "They, didn't have any announcements or anything about me not being there?" "No, why would they?" No reason." Eddie was relieved. If Steve and his mum were looking for him, they hadn't gone to the cops, at least not yet. Cops should have made an announcement on the PA at school. Eddie had heard them when other kids were gone for a while. Maybe Steve was afraid to go to the cops. Maybe he figured if somebody saw the bruises on Eddie's body, he might be in more trouble than Eddie. I've been visiting my aunt over in Bridgeland. She's sick." He didn't like lying to Linda, but at least Bridgeland was not far from the zoo, so maybe the lie wasn't that bad. He didn't know why he'd lied to her at all. It didn't really matter if Linda knew he'd taken off. Maybe she'd even think it was cool. Anyway, it was too late. He'd said it. He'd have to go with it now. "So when are you coming back?" "Pretty soon, I guess." Suddenly, Eddie wanted out of there. For one thing, he didn't want to hear himself lie anymore, and there was no telling how much more BS he'd have to throw out now that he'd started. Maybe I'll wander over to the castle and see if Charlie's there." He didn't bother to correct himself this time. Linda must have heard her brother's nickname. "Yeah," she said. That was another thing about Linda Chen. She had a great voice, sort of husky and low. She could make a word like "yeah" do interesting things inside your head. He tried to imagine that it would be like what it would be like to kiss her. Long and slow and sexy, and then afterwards to hear that voice saying, "Eddie, that was so great." Yeah, right. He stood up and turned to go, but before he got to the door, Linda said, "Maybe I'll come along with you. I need to get out of here for a while." Eddie swallowed a couple of times. First of all, girls like Linda didn't usually hang out at arcades, not even excellent ones like the castle. And he didn't figure she'd be into watching her brother shoot pool and smoke cigarettes. So that meant Linda Chen wanted to go for a walk with him, Eddie Slater, on a public street where people, real people, might see them together. His mind started going real fast. Geez, I've spent the last few nights sleeping in a storage shed. I haven't had a shower in a week, and my clothes probably look like zoo animals have been dancing on them. This isn't how I pictured my first date with Linda Chen, but of course it wasn't a real date. While Linda was getting her coat, Eddie checked himself out in a mirror that was hanging on a door, a closet maybe. Face, hair, no better or worse than normal. Clothes, not bad at all. Considering where they'd been, the shoes were the worst. They were gross with mud splotches and grass stains covering the parts that used to be white. He swore at himself for not cleaning them up before he got there. Oh well, nothing he could do about it now. He'd just have to hope Linda didn't spend a lot of time looking down. She came back wearing one of those fake suede jackets. Even the fake version probably cost more than everything Eddie had taken when he left home. He looked great. She looked great. He held the door for her, but she motioned him out first so she could lock it. and the way to the arcade they mostly talked about cars. Linda was interested in hot cars, Porsches, Jags, BMWs. Yeah, no problem there, Linda. I'll just pick you up next Friday night in the Testarossa, and we'll do cocktails and dinner. Eddie was beginning to think he fit in better at the zoo, at least with the animals. He didn't have to put on an act and try to be somebody he wasn't. The thing about zebras and rhinos and all the rest, they didn't really care what your shoes looked like or what kind of car you drove. What kind of movies do you like? He was hoping to get off the topic of high-performance cars. Oh, you know, Jean-Claude Van Damme, Arnold Schwarzenegger, and I really liked the Charlie's Angels movies. Yeah, me too, he lied again. He hoped she wouldn't get too into any details. Eddie had only seen a couple of action movies, videos, and that Steve brought home, and he thought they were pretty stupid. Not that he'd say that to Linda. All that crap about being yourself, Eddie figured that might be okay if the self you were being was a whole lot cooler than he was. What about You've Got Mail? Do you like that one? He only asked the question because he'd read somewhere that if it was a chick flick, he hadn't seen it yet, but it sounded better than 5 or 6 Charlie's Angels sequels. God, that wasn't that dumb, Linda laughed. All those love movies just kill me. They are so unbelievable and stupid. Yeah, totally stupid. He agreed. The evening wasn't going well, no doubt about that. Eddie had started to think that he and Linda might not have much of a future together. They got to the arcade, and though the place was packed, Charlie wasn't there. Eddie played a couple of games of Atomic Punk 2, and on the second game racked a score of 37,000 points. The screen said it was the second highest score ever, but Linda didn't seem to notice. They were getting ready to leave when a big guy with a mohawk and a pathetic attempt at a Fu Manchu mustache stepped in front of them. He was wearing a muscle shirt and smoking a cigarette, and he blew a cloud of smoke in their faces. Eddie didn't recognize him at first right away. Maybe it was the bad mustache. Then he remembered the guy had been in the Calgary Young Offenders Center at the same time as Eddie. Eddie didn't know much about him, but he'd heard lots, most of it bad. The guy's name was Stink something. Pender or Parker, Eddie wasn't exactly sure. What he was sure about was that Stink had reputation as somebody who didn't mind hurting people just for fun. In fact, Stink was in the CYOC because he'd beaten the crap out of some kid for laughing at one of his answers in English class. The kid needed major surgery to rebuild his face. Stink wasn't in the CYOC long, and Eddie, and just about everyone else, was really happy when he left. But for Eddie, Stink's departure came one day too late. A bunch of kids had been playing basketball in the gymnasium. Eddie and Stink were on opposing teams. The whole thing was weird because in the entire time he was in the place, Eddie had never once played basketball. It wasn't much of a game. Stink's team was winning big, and Stink scored most of the points right near the end of the game. Eddie and Stink got tangled up. Eddie came away with the ball and actually scored. Eddie was jumping around celebrating because of him. Baskets were almost as rare as girlfriends. The next thing he knew, he was on his back with Stink's big hands around his throat. He was having trouble getting air by the time the guards and a teacher got Stink off of him. "Do that again, you piece of shit, and I'll rip that joke you call a face." That wasn't as far as Stink got before the guards hauled him out of the gymnasium. And now here they were, Stink, who went psycho when somebody showed him up, and Eddie, who had done the showing. Had Stink remembered him? So far Eddie didn't think so, mostly because Stink hadn't noticed him at all. The creep's attention was totally on Linda. He was grinning at Linda, his cigarette still in his mouth. Eddie realized that he was scared. Stink gave a person lots to be scared about. He was a year or two older than Eddie, and at least had a head taller. He had tattoos on both arms. Lightning bolts and naked women seemed to be Stink's favorite themes. He had a pool cue in his hands, and he was carrying it so that it blocked the way out. Yeah, Eddie was scared. He couldn't tell, but he figured Linda was scared too. Eddie noticed that the arcade was suddenly a lot less noisy. The smoke was still there, hanging at about eye level, and it was still crowded, but it was quieter now, and there wasn't as much moving around. It was like the whole place was watching to see what would happen. "Hey, babe," Stink said, still looking at Linda. "It's about time you and me." He made an obscene gesture that wasn't too hard to figure out. Now Eddie was sure Linda was scared. She hadn't said or done anything, but she didn't need to. You can tell when somebody is scared. She moved a little closer to him. "Yeah, like I'm going to protect you from Stink the Wacko." "Take a hike," Linda told Stink. It was about what you'd expect somebody to say in this situation, but it wasn't real effective. Linda's voice wasn't helping her out. She hadn't actually squeaked, but it was pretty close. Eddie couldn't take his eyes off Stink. It's weird how sometimes you can't stop looking at somebody, even if he's one of the biggest jerks going. Watching him, Eddie was sure Stink thought Linda actually wanted him. Guys like him usually think that way. Stink reached out and rubbed his hand up and down Linda's arm. This time her voice worked just fine. "Hands off, dirtbag!" "Hey, baby, you're my woman," Stink grinned at her. It didn't help his overall appearance. There was nothing but air where a couple of teeth should have been. That surprised Eddie. He'd heard that Stink came from a wealthy family. Pegler. That was his last name, Stink Pegler. Real wealthy. In fact, the word at the CYOC was that it was Daddy's money that got Stink out so fast. You'd think if that was true, his old man could have invested a little of the cash into something to fill the gaps in the kid's mouth. "You and me both know it's gonna happen." Stink leaned closer to Linda. "Either way, you can love it or fight it, but I'm going to have a real good time on that nice little body of yours." As he was talking, Stink reached out and touched Linda again, only this time it wasn't on the arm. Afterwards, when he thought about it, Eddie decided that what happened next must have been caused by malnutrition. The burger and fries was the first actual meal he'd eaten in about 3 days. He'd heard that not eating enough can make you lightheaded. Or maybe it was all those bad sleeps in the storage shed. Whatever the reason, he lost it. Eddie kicked Stink Pegler between the legs, the 5-hole bullseye direct hit, like a place kicker putting one through the goalposts. That was probably what saved them, the kick being a perfect shot. Stink crumpled up like tissue in a campfire and fell to the floor. But even lying on the floor, holding himself and making sucking noises, Stink was dangerous. He puked. Eddie had to move fast because Stink had puked in the direction of his shoes. Dirt and grass stains were one thing, but Eddie drew the line at Stink vomit. As he was rolling around on the floor, Stink looked up at Eddie through water-clouded eyes in a way it was almost funny. Well, at least he's finally noticed me, Eddie thought. He looked down at the writhing figure on the arcade floor, Stink Pegler with missing teeth and puke running down his hairy chin, and a face that hated. As much as somebody can hate wasn't a real pretty picture. You again, Stink said it in a voice that Eddie could barely hear. Stink tried to get up on one knee, but he slumped back on the floor, his eyes never leaving Eddie's face. You're one dead bastard. Even with pain all through them, Stink's words scared the crap out of Eddie, because he knew that if Stink ever got the chance, he'd make those words come true. Eddie felt Linda pulling at his arm. He didn't need a lot of coaxing. They stepped around Stink Pegler and ran into the street. They turned right and didn't stop running until they were 4 blocks from the arcade. They leaned against the brick wall of a building, pressing their chests like that might help get some oxygen back into their burning lungs. Eddie slid down the wall until he was sitting on the pavement. After a while, he was able to breathe a little better. He looked up and watched the neon sign of a furniture store flashing on and off. It was as if his senses were on Zoom. Somewhere close by there was a smell that was familiar. It was like the garage of his parents' house in Long Prairie, a combination of grease and wet clothes. At least it seemed like that. Linda spoke first. Shit. Yeah. I think he meant it about you being dead. Probably. Eddie nodded. He wondered why Linda felt it necessary to remind him of Stink's threat. It wasn't like Eddie was going to forget, at least not for quite a while. I'm pretty sure Stink Pegler could kill someone if he hated them enough. Linda looked at him. Eddie let his head slump forward and stared at a chunk of the pavement. You didn't have to do that, you know, Linda said. He looked up at her. Oh, really? Well, it looked to me like I had to do something, and I was a little short of ideas at that exact moment. And thanks for cheering me up like this. I mean, thanks. Eddie tilted his head back so that it rested against the cool brick of the building. It felt good. Linda was fumbling around in her purse. You got a cigarette? Eddie shook his head as he watched her. He just risked his life for a woman who liked Arnold Schwarzenegger better than she liked Tom Hanks. He stood up. We better get going. I'm not sure how long sore gonads will keep Stink from forming a posse and coming after us. They started running again. When they got to Linda's house, the goodbyes were short. You better tell your brother about this, Eddie advised. He should be able to keep Stink under control. I'm not the one with the problem. He only wants to have sex with me. He wants to kill you. I wish you wouldn't keep bringing that up. Eddie went back to the zoo using the same alleyways and side streets that he'd traveled earlier that night. He arrived with all his pots still attached. He would never have believed that the storage shed could actually look good, but just then it was about the most inviting piece of architecture he'd ever seen. He didn't expect his sleep that night to be any better than all the rest, but at least it wasn't the big sleep, the knife in the guts kind. Eddie lay on the cardboard mattress for quite a while, trying to decide if the evening had been a success or not. He fell asleep before he had made up his mind.